In this lecture, I'll discuss Chapter 5 of Lavenda and Schultz's Anthropology, What Does It Mean to be Human? Specifically, this chapter examines the fossil record and what it can tell us about human origins. Hence, it continues our discussion in biological anthropology, with particular emphasis in the specialty of paleoanthropology. Overall in this lecture, I'd like to discuss hominid evolution and bipedalism. The two main factors that contributed in our evolutionary history are the development of our brain and our cognitive capacities along with that, including the propensity for language and culture, as well as bipedalism, which conferred a number of advantages for our early ancestors. I'll talk a little bit about some of our early ancestors going into the Australopithecines, looking at some of the early Homo species, looking at different hypotheses which drive the force of evolution, whether this is the man the hunter or woman the gatherer hypotheses. We'll look at what we can see in the archaeological, paleoanthropological record in terms of culture, and a lot of this comes in the form of stone tools and stone tool traditions. Finally, I'll examine the replacement and regional continuity models, as well as examine the success of hominids overall. Hominid evolution, a key factor here, and you can see the footprints at Latolle, and you can see this also, the reenactment or recreation of these footprints with the National Geographic Special Mysteries of Mankind, which is also available on Blackboard. But this was a really key development, this notion of bipedalism or walking on 2 feet. Some early evidence suggested around 3.6 million years ago with direct evidence for this. Recently, the date's been moved back to nearly 4 million years ago. What bipedalism indicates is upright posture, which is evident in the skeletal reconstruction overall. So what are some of the advantages of bipedalism? Well, getting up off of all fours allows us, or allowed early hominids, to see predators in view, to realize that danger was coming and then get out of its way. It also allowed for faster locomotion in order to avoid predators, allowed for improved stamina overall. And this is a real key feature of our species in particular, our ability to engage in persistence hunting. And we'll be talking about this later in the semester with examples from the Kalahari, where you have the run to the death, or the hunt by running, or the running to the death in really high temperature days. Part of this upright posture allows for more efficient locomotion, as well as less exposure to the sun's rays, which all of these things together will enhance our ability to essentially outrun other species over long periods of time. Also, being on 2 feet allows us to free up our hands for a number of different things, such as being able to carry infants, food, as well as tools. The oldest hominids come from Africa, the Afar Triangle, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Chad, and South Africa are all key sites for early hominid evolution. The dates for this are anywhere between 7 and 6 million years ago, where the first hominids appear. These are both Australopithecines and early Homo sites. The Australopithecines emerged between 3 and 1.5 million years ago. There were 2 main types, the gracile Australopithecines between 3 and 2 million years ago. And these were smaller with more tightly built faces. Whereas the robust Australopithecines between 2 and 1.5 million years ago had rugged jaws, flatter faces, more enlarged jaw muscles, which allowed for huge molars for grinding. Some similarities between these two: the foramen magnum, which is directly under the skull, was directly under the skull, and they had a similar cranial capacity. And this becomes a key distinguishing factor in our evolutionary history, along with bipedalism. The early Australopithecines, the later Australopithecines had between 400 and 550 cubic centimeters in cranial capacity overall. Now, within the paleoanthropological record, much is debated in terms of what species was using what technologies and how they were utilizing them. There is some evidence to suggest that Australopithecines used fire in order to cook meat, as well as using bone fragments as tools for digging. Now, there were attempts to explain the transition to human beings. And one of the early attempts was the man the hunter hypothesis. And this essentially stated that human beings and hominids developed into what are today humans modern human physical and behavioral characteristics that developed from hominid hunting patterns. The major supporting evidence for this was essentially a feedback loop where you had tools to kill animals based on increased cognitive capacity, and then this led to expanded brains with a more meat kill. So you had better tools, which allowed for more killing of meat, which allowed for increased cranial capacity, which in turn led to better tools. So a positive feedback loop overall. In looking at other contemporary primates, this is supported in part by looking at savanna baboons and looking at their rigid hierarchy and structure. They had a relatively closed society wherein males would dominate much smaller females as well as the youth. Now, there were many critiques of man the hunter. Many believe that this reflected the beliefs of roles of women and men that were of contemporary society during the time period in the United States and Europe in the 1960s. The 1950s, 1960s. Now, there was also ethnographic fieldwork which indicated that survival depended more on foraging for food rather than hunting overall, and hence egalitarian relations were important due to the division of labor between men and women and the sharing of food overall within society. Hence, you had the development of the woman the gatherer hypothesis, which stressed the female's role in human evolution as a whole. This is just as the man the hunter hypothesis is supported by looking at other primates, so too is the woman the gatherer hypothesis, which adherents would believe that it is supported by chimpanzees, where you have males and females who are less reliant upon one another. They feed themselves as well as their infants, and the offspring bond is closer than the mate bond, so there's food sharing overall. Early Homo species emerged between 2.4 and 1.5 million years ago. Again, note the increase in cranial capacity as the key indicator for the development of hominids. Here, early Homo species between 2.4 and 1.5 million years ago have a larger cranial capacity than the Australopithecines. Remember, the Australopithecines were in the 400 range in terms of cubic centimeters. For the early Homo species, you had between 510 and 570 cubic centimeters. The skulls were thinner, the faces were flatter in proportion of the cranium, the teeth and jaws were less rugged, and the body size did not get larger, indicating potentially that the larger brain was a key part in the natural selection processes overall. It's also important to consider that the species of Homo coexisted with robust Australopithecines, which became extinct 1 million years ago. And so this calls into question the notion of phyletic gradualism. The earliest evidence of culture that we can see in the paleoanthropological record is from stone tools. In the Olwan stone tool tradition, it has been hypothesized that you are working essentially with cores, and if you have a few flakes that are knocked off these in order to form cutting edges. These are very simple tools, and sometimes not discernible even at very high levels of training from other naturally occurring rocks. So how does one actually ascertain whether in fact you have a tool or whether you have a rock that just got chipped from falling or something like that? And so paleoanthropologists use taphonomy, which is the study of signs on stones and bones showing wear from human usage, where you either have tooth marks versus tool cuts on bones. Taphonomy reveals that early hominins were more scavengers than hunters, that many marks on the bones in fact came from non-hominins, and that home bases were not permanent. Now, this is also shown in the film Mysteries of Mankind, which highlights the notion of taphonomy and sand abrasion on bones overall. Also, the question comes into mind here is where do you have, which group is in fact responsible for which bones overall? Rick Potts, in his 1993 hypothesis, the stone cache hypothesis, noted that early hominins were in fact hiding tools in different locations where they could essentially process meat, process animal kills, and you had a collection of stones as well as animal parts here in this region. And then as the capacity for protection of these home bases developed, this is where these caches essentially became the home bases for early hominins. Again, this is much debated within anthropology, within paleoanthropology as well. Homo erectus emerges between 1.8 and 1.7 million years ago and becomes extinct between 500,000 and 0.4 million years ago. They're the first hominids to migrate outside of Africa, with fossils found in Asia. The oldest erectus fossil is Turkana boy, which is found 1.7 million years ago, which is rather distinct from other Homo erectus specimens due to it being rather tall. Having potential, others also question with erectus whether they had neural control in terms of breathing and whether they were able to speak to one another or not. And again, this skeleton is also different from other erectus found in Asia. Some of the morphological traits of erectus here, look at the cranial capacity increasing fairly dramatically to about 1,000 cubic centimeters, where you had earlier Homo species between 610 and 750 cubic centimeters. Sexual dimorphism is reduced here, with males being only 20 to 30% larger than females. A general theory for this change is that there was less competition for mates, indicating potential monogamy, and more male care for offspring. But again, the question becomes, are we in fact putting our own values upon what erectus was doing during this time period? The culture of erectus becomes more complex. With the increased cognitive capacity becomes the increased ability to fashion tools from the environment in order to modify niches, in order to create tools and utilize certain technologies. The early Stone Age, or Aleutian stone tool tradition, you had larger stone cores, which were bifaces. Both Aleutian as well as Olawan stone tools have been used simultaneously. This indicates that more than one hominid species may have used tools from a particular archaeological culture. Also, stone tools in Asia are markedly different from those in Africa as well as Europe. And Fagan from 1990 suggests that bamboo and other forest materials were effective substitutions. Of course, these don't appear regularly in the archaeological record because of preservation overall. There were also traces found of hearths and burned stones that show erectus-controlled fire. Now, was Homo erectus hunting? Were they scavenging overall? The bones that are found next to tools do not, in fact, prove that Homo erectus hunted animals. There are no solid claims to show that fire was actually used to control meat. And there are also missing fragments of face and cranial at the base of the skull, which was previously thought to be the result of cannibalism, which also could have been a result of hyena activity. Excavations of sites with various animal remains could be a result of geologic changes, so you have both cultural transforms and natural transforms, which are going to influence the site overall. And then the fossils being washed away from the original locations rather than big game hunting overall. So there's still a lot of speculation within the archaeological, paleoanthropological record in terms of what various Homo species were doing during their tenure on Earth. Now, where did modern Homo sapiens come from? There are two main ideas. The replacement model, where you have a subpopulation of erectus, probably in Africa, which rapidly evolved into Homo sapiens between 200 and 100,000 years ago. Climate as well as environmental changes during geologic time were the main catalyst for this evolutionary spurt, or this idea of speciation. These species then grew and replaced Homo erectus in other parts of the globe. The regional continuity model, on the other hand, suggests that erectus populations evolved according to their regional conditions gradually. So you had morphological similarities between erectus from Java and Australian Homo sapiens, between European Homo erectus and European Neanderthal. And gene flow connected all the different populations and kept them within the same species. So if you're a graphical person, you'll note that the replacement model is indicated on the left, which essentially shows that you have an erectus species which is developing in Africa, and then as it moves out of Africa, it becomes into archaic Homo sapiens, and then those move into Europe, Asia, and Australia, essentially replacing Homo erectus in each of those locations. On the other hand, the regional continuity model would suggest that you have Homo erectus and emerging, you have Homo sapiens developing, and then modern Homo sapiens in each one of the areas. So the out of Africa versus the regional continuity, the gene flow between these different populations to keep them all within the same species. There have been a lot of discussions about Neanderthals, particularly recently with Neanderthal genome coding and looking at the overlap between 1 and 4% of Neanderthal genes are shared with European and East Asian populations. The Neanderthals are found in Europe as well as West Asia. They're shorter and more stout with larger teeth than modern Homo sapiens. Their large teeth as well as extended jaw suggest that the front teeth could have been used as a clamp. Interestingly enough here, their cranial capacity is larger than modern humans, but they have a less round skull shape. Pattern of brain asymmetry between the right and left halves. The Neanderthals are also very robust. They're heavily muscled. They have a powerful grip. Some would speculate that this was due to the glacial environments that they inhabited in Europe. During this time period, you have the development of more complex stone tools. So you have Oldowan, Aleutian, and Mousterian stone tool tradition now. The European fossils are labeled under the Middle Paleolithic, while stone tools found in Africa are assigned to the Middle Stone Age designator. The key distinguishing factor from early Stone Age culture is that the tools were made out of flakes here as opposed to cores in the past. The Mousterian or the Middle Stone Age Middle Stone Age tools were similar in form. You have flint material, which is dominant in the fossil remains found in Europe, and volcanic rock, which is prevalent in Africa. Most rock shelters were found near fresh water, but these are possible living sites where you have the remnants of hearth and stone tools that are found in the area. Some other cultural remains of the Neanderthals, you have hearths, pits, and burials, possibly indicating establishment of early religion. You have bear skulls as part of a collection of a cave bear cult. Flowers near grave sites, potentially with indications from float tanks in sites indicating high levels of pollen concentrations, which could either be that the flowers were laid out over a grave or potentially indicative of weather patterns which would blow pollen into a particular cave, and then the pollen would settle out on top of a recent burial. But what we do see for certain amongst Neanderthals is a concern for the old and the sick. Many of the Neanderthals would have had what would have been earlier considered life-threatening, indeed life-ending injuries and illnesses. However, they have many of these in the skeletal remains that can be seen, indicating that those that were healthy cared for those that were old and sick. Evidence suggests that Neanderthals were engaged in hunting, but again, some of the same questions come up. Impact damage does show that stone tools could have been used as weapons, and animal remains have been found at Neanderthal sites. However, again, finding animal fossils near Neanderthal dwellings might be the result of geologic displacement over time. The diet was similar, in fact, to modern Homo sapiens. Anatomically modern humans with a cranial capacity of about 1,350 cubic centimeters have some differences with the Neanderthal population as a whole. As a whole, we're more rounded heads and flatter faces with a lighter build. Further, our skeletal mass decreased for about 20,000 years after the first appearance, suggesting that these humans relied more on cultural traditions to make up for the lack of physical robustness in relation to Neanderthals and other species. The first appearance of modern humans was initially thought to have occurred about 40,000 years ago. However, several fossils found in the 1970s and 1980s could not be properly dated. And again, this is where this date of 40,000 years comes out. More recent dating suggests a date between 74 and 60,000 years ago for the emergence of modern humans. Again, here we have an increase in capacity and cognitive capacity, and we see this very evident in the culture of a given area, particularly, again, stone tools. You have the development of blades technology, where you have a flake twice as long as its width. You have the use of composite tools such as bows and arrows, displaying interchangeable features of late Stone Age tools. You have customizing tools to specific sizes and shapes, which suggest new patterns of social and economic cooperation were being developed. And stone tool varieties were being replaced much more frequently than in the past, every 20,000 years as compared to slight change over 100,000 years in the Middle Stone Age. One explanation for this is that the human brain underwent a reorganization that allowed for the propensity of culture. This is inferred from analysis of the cultural remains, as there is no anatomical data in order to prove this. Again, with the late Stone Age and the upper Paleolithic, we have blade technology, sewing techniques, and a variety of weapons coming into play. Droppings were likely used for fuel as well as building materials. Humans had a foraging lifestyle with a plant-based diet in warmer climates where you had a more meat-based diet for colder Arctic, subarctic regions. More elaborate burials were present with evidence of human creation. Human bones were used as mementos of the dead as well as for ritual purposes. And you had the development of symbolic practices in terms of rock and cave paintings, engravings, clay figures of animals as well as humans, such as the Venus figurines, which are covered in your textbook. Also, there is the clip of the movement of or the early cinema of some of these cave paintings as a torch is waved back and forth across the painting. It shows movement, so this shows a fair amount of conceptual thought overall. The modern Homo sapiens spread in the late Pleistocene times. They were the most numerous and widespread of hominid species with a longer life expectancy of more than 20% than Neanderthals, as well as a healthier life with fewer illnesses and injuries, diseases, and whatnot. Healthier teeth as well. Indications of a developing trade network as speech and cultural innovations progressed. So you see artifacts of amber found in locations where you wouldn't see these types of trees. You see seashells found in areas far away from where they naturally occur from the shore. And then you see the migration of hominids to distant lands, East Asia and Siberia, where we see in the paleoanthropological record first appearance of Homo sapiens between 35 and 20,000 years ago. In the Americas, with Clovis points dating Homo sapiens to about 12,500 years ago. And then in Australasia, where there were modern remains of modern humans are dated between 25 and 20,000 years ago. So I've given you a very brief look at some of the complexity in the development of our species over time. Indeed, the success of our species and of hominins in general is that we are a generalist, as Potts suggests, rather than a notion of survival of the fittest. We can utilize many different environments, and we'll be talking about this over the course of the semester, through cultural constructions of the environment and niche constructions where we bend the environment to suit our own purposes. And we as a species are very successful in inhabiting the major ecological regions of this planet, and indeed looking into space exploration, looking into work in inhabiting other locations as a whole. And again, part of this includes standardized living structures, trade networks and ritual activities, as well as overall social networks and division of labor. So in this lecture, I hope to have provided a brief glimpse into hominid evolution, which considers both the development of our cognitive capacities, indicative most apparently in the paleoanthropological record in the context of stone tools, as well as the development of bipedalism. I've talked about some of the early Homo species as well as the Australopithecines, compared and contrasted the man the hunter hypothesis with the woman the gatherer hypothesis, looked at the stone tool traditions overall, compared and contrasted the out of Africa replacement and regional continuity models, and then looked at the success of hominids overall.